On CFUW President Catherine Wilkinson, who will bring greetings from CFUW, and she will also read a land acknowledgement. Catherine, please.
Thank you. I'm pleased to bring greetings from CFUW National to members and guests attending this evening, and especially to our three speakers. We are delighted and honoured that you can join us this evening. CFUW acknowledges the enduring presence of First Nation, Métis and Inuit people on this land, and we recognise past and ongoing forms of colonialism experienced by our First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples, and are committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect. I'm speaking from Coldwater, Ontario, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, and specifically the Chippewas of Rama's First Nation. This territory is covered by the John Collins Purchase of 1795 and the Williams Treaties of 1923. CFUW members and guests participating this evening will be attending from locations from coast to coast to coast that are on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. And I encourage everyone, if they do not already know, to visit nativeland.ca to find whose land they live on as part of our ongoing commitment to truth and reconciliation. As a settler, I acknowledge this territory's significance for the Indigenous people who lived and continue to live in this region, and whose practices and ties to this land allow me and other settlers to be able to enjoy the waterways, the wildlife, and the land on the traditional territory of the Chippewas. CFUW is committed to learn more about the issues facing Indigenous peoples. We aim to listen to the recommendation of Indigenous community members and activists on how we can show support and solidarity in fostering relationships and respect between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Miigwech.
Thank you, Catherine. The Indigenous Peoples Committee, too, is pleased to welcome everyone to this webinar being hosted by this committee. As suggested by committee member Heather Foss, we've titled the webinar, Indigenous Issues, Calls to Action. The committee's focus is on educating ourselves and others, and we see this webinar as another step along that road of recognizing the past and ongoing forms of colonialism and dispossession experienced by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in this country. As we learn more about the current issues facing Indigenous peoples, how we can stand in support and solidarity as allies, building relationships based on mutual consent and trust. Action often follows awareness, but what action? For that, we turn to our panel of experts to share their knowledge with us tonight. We hope that at the end of this webinar, we will all be more aware of issues and what relevant actions would be appropriate for us as individual members of civil society or as CFUW members to become engaged in. Co-chair Sharon Crabb, who is a member of the Charitable Trust Board, will speak next. Sharon, please.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'd like to take a few moments to speak about the Charitable Trust Fellowships and Awards Program. The Charitable Trust Fellowships and Awards Program assists Canadian women doing advanced graduate study and research in such areas as science, math, engineering, home economics, education, visual arts, music, humanities, and social sciences. In March of 2015, the Education Council of Wolfville, Nova Scotia, transferred the proceeds of their education fund to the CFUW Charitable Trust to establish a new award, the CFUW Aboriginal Women's Award. The value range of this award is $10,000 to $25,000, and the award is renewable, and it is awarded to a Canadian Aboriginal woman studying in Canada. As a gift in recognition of tonight's panelists, we welcome all those in attendance to consider a donation to the Charitable Trust Fellowships and Awards. You may have previously received an Indigenous Issues Call to Action bulletin featuring the bios of today's presenters. If so, at the bottom of that bulletin is a notation. Click here to make a donation to the CFUW Charitable Trust. You can also donate by going to the CFUW Charitable Trust Fellowships and Awards Program website. Click on How to Donate and then on canadahelps.org donation form. On the form, you will see the words General Fund with a drop-down menu listing all of the awards. There you can choose the CFUW Aboriginal Women's Award and make your donation. To those of you who've already donated, we thank you so much for your support. And back to Grace.
Thank you, Sharon. And I remember well how pleased Eleanor Palmer and the Wolfville Club were when they passed over that fund to CFUW for that scholarship. So we have three panelists tonight: Judge Marion Buller, Bev Sellars, and Lema Ijtemaye. Can the panelists please wave so that the other participants can see you and know who you are? Thank you. Panelists will have up to 20 minutes each and will receive a gentle reminder from Sharon when 1 minute remains. Each will be introduced in turn, and after all three have spoken, there will be a question and answer period. Charlotte and Kathy Wasnick will look after that later on. The chair of the Education Committee will introduce our first speaker. So this is Kathy Wasnick, and she will introduce the Honourable Judge Marion Buller and tell us about the focus of her presentation as well. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Grace. Just before we start, just a quick note. If you have a question, please put it in chat. We don't have a Q&A in this format, so please put it in the chat, and if you have a question for a specific presenter, please indicate that. Otherwise, whoever wishes to answer will just direct the question more generally. It's my pleasure to introduce Judge Marion Buller. Judge Buller is a jurist in British Columbia who served as the Chief Commissioner for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. As a member of the Mishtawassis, I hope I said that right, First Nation, she was the first First Nations woman to be appointed to the Provincial Court at British Columbia in 1994 and presided over courts throughout BC. She established the First Nations Courts of British Columbia in 2006 and provided the foundation for the Aboriginal Family Healing Court in 2016. Judge Buller served as president of the Indigenous Bar Association and director of the BC Law Court Society, BC Law Foundation, BC Police Commission, and the BC Mediators Roster. Judge Buller has lectured and written numerous articles and papers about Aboriginal law, criminal law, family law, and human rights. Judge Marion Buller's presentation will focus on the work of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and give us some suggestions for achieving the cause for justice.
Thank you, Kathy. Welcome everyone to my home on the traditional unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people, also known as Vancouver, British Columbia. In addition to what Kathy told you about me, I'm also a grandma, a sister, an auntie, a great auntie, cousin, niece, mother-in-law, stepmom. I think I covered all of my relationships there. From time to time, I will be referring to some speaking notes. I'm not texting anyone or playing video games. I just wanted to let you know that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Inquiry, the work that we did do, then move on to our calls for justice, which is what we named our recommendations, and then talk a little bit about what you can do as individuals and as an organization to make Canada safer for everyone, but especially for Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. And I just should explain, Two-Spirit people are those people who are gifted with both male and female spirits. So the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. The three commissioners, Commissioner Michelle Odette, who I think a lot of you already know, Commissioner Brian A. Olson, and Commissioner Kaya Robinson, and I were required to inquire into all systemic causes of all types of violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S people, and then to make recommendations to end that violence. Now, I have to tell you, our terms of reference were a great deal longer than that, but that's sort of in a nutshell what we were required to do. We started our work on September 1st, 2016, and our mandate ended on June 30th, 2019. During that time, we held 15 community hearings. These are hearings in which we heard from family members of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S people and survivors of violence. We heard about their experiences with the police, with the court system, with child welfare, oh my goodness, with healthcare, the media. Let me look at my notes, see if I've missed any. Transportation, another one, and people in the hospitality industry and the extraction industries. Then, based on what family members and survivors told us, we held 9 what we called subject matter hearings, and we heard from experts, what we often consider experts, but as importantly, and maybe more importantly, we heard from traditional knowledge keepers and elders. We held subject matter hearings on racism, policing, colonial violence. I'm sorry, I have to go back to my list again. Human rights, Indigenous laws and decolonization, the sex industry, government services, child welfare, and the criminal justice system. Our hearings were held from coast to coast to coast, and I think we were in every province and territory, save and except PEI, at least once. We also held a series of roundtables. These were more informal discussions aimed at specific groups of people. We had roundtables regarding issues, specific issues faced by Métis people, Inuit people, Two-Spirit people, and those people in Quebec, because in Quebec, the history of Indigenous people is so much different than everywhere else because of the impact of the Roman Catholic Church, who actually was also the government of Quebec, really, in practice, for a very long time. In total, we heard from 2,386 people across Canada in our hearings. And we also engaged a number of people in our validation process. That's where we took drafts of our final report and went back to people and said, okay, now did we hear you correctly? Did we understand and accurately write what you told us? Helping sort of behind the scenes in all of this was an absolutely fabulous research team led by Dr. Corinne Duhamel, who is an Indigenous woman from Manitoba. They did an amazing body of work for us at the National Inquiry. We produced an interim report as required by our terms of reference in November of 2017. And then we produced our final report in June of 2019. We named our final report Reclaiming Power in Place because really that's what has to happen. Indigenous women and girls and 2S people have to reclaim their traditional positions of power and influence in communities and in Canada, not just in their home communities. That's what we need to do in order to make it safe for Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. We also published 2 additional volumes. One was a separate report on the province of Quebec and the issues that Indigenous women and girls and 2S people have faced in Quebec, again, because of the difference in history. We also produced a separate supplemental report on the issue of genocide, because we knew that our finding of genocide was going to be quite controversial. And once again, we were right, it was quite controversial. All of our documents, including our education guide called Their Voices Will Guide Us, is available on our website. That's still available and still open, or whatever the proper term is. It is mmIWG-FFADA.ca. And I'll just backtrack for a moment. Our education guide, Their Voices Will Guide Us, is a guide for teachers to teach about the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S people, all the way from kindergarten to post-secondary. It's a brilliant piece of work. I can't claim to write it, but it's very helpful for teaching at all levels. So turning now to our findings of fact, well, we found that there's been past and present human and Indigenous rights violations by the federal state, Canada, the provinces, and the territories. And these past and present human rights and Indigenous rights violations are the causes of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S people, because those rights violations and abuses, I should add, have over time forced Indigenous women and girls and 2S people into the margins, literally geographically into the margins, economically and socially into the margins. And they have been disempowered and have become targets of violence, or targets for violence. This process of human and Indigenous rights violations and abuses will come as no surprise to you. It's colonization, because that's what Canada did. Canada is a colonial state. I suppose that one of the best things I heard from an elder, because I heard a lot of really good things from elders, was we've got to have a complete new way of thinking, that it's no longer for us or to us as Indigenous people, but now it has to be with us and by us. And of course, tied into our findings of fact were the needs for self-government and self-determination. So again, it's in just a couple of sentences, paraphrasing our findings of fact. Now, turning to our calls for justice, that's what we called our recommendations. And I just have to share with you briefly a little story. Dr. Duhamel, who was our director of research, and the commissioners and I were trying to decide what to call our recommendations. We didn't want to call them recommendations. We didn't want to piggyback onto the TRC and call them calls to action, because of course the TRC work is brilliant, and we didn't want to in any way detract or interfere from their work. So Dr. Duhamel said, well, I've read all the transcripts, I've heard the testimony, and you know, what the families and survivors want is justice. So why don't we call the recommendations calls for justice? And who could argue with that? It was, once again, she was absolutely on point. There are 231 total calls for justice. They're not recommendations or just recommendations, as I say. They're legal imperatives. And by that, I mean, they must be done. Canada has signed on to a variety of international human rights and Indigenous rights and nonviolence declarations and international instruments. We also in Canada have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have the Old Human Rights Act. We have a variety of other acts as well in Canada. And while we have all these acts and international instruments, Canada is still violating Indigenous and human rights, contrary to the position Canada has taken internationally and nationally. And so the rights violations simply have to stop. I don't think I really need to explain that much more, other than Canada's breaking the law, the provinces and territories are breaking the law, and it simply has to stop. So our calls for justice are aimed at specific audiences. They're not all sort of lumped together. We have calls for justice, for example, that are aimed at all governments, including Indigenous governments. Calls for justice aimed at the hospitality industry, extractive industries, the media, lawyers and law societies, the criminal justice system, child welfare, healthcare, corrections. I think I've named them all, but for today's purposes, probably the most important are the calls for justice that all Canadians can act on. Now, again, I'm going to paraphrase. The calls for justice for all Canadians really are lengthy, and you can pick and choose where you want to start. But again, I'll paraphrase. First of all, everyone, every Canadian has to call out racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. And you know, we have to support everyone else who does that. Because I'm sure we all know about the trolls on the internet who will push back about any statement against hate crimes, but especially racism and sexism, homo and transphobia. So not only do it ourselves, but support others that do. Speak out against violence against Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. And again, support those people who speak out against that violence. Learn the real history of Canada. In other words, decolonize yourself. I know as individuals and as an organization, you've started to educate yourself about the colonial history of Canada and the impact of colonialism in Canada. And I strongly urge you to continue that education, both individually and as an organization, and challenge other organizations to do the same thing. Learn about your Indigenous neighbors, who's living next to you. I like the idea of everybody looking up nativeland.ca to find out whose territory you're on. And not only learn about whose territory you're on, but learn about the people. Get to know your neighbors, find out who they are. Attend events that they sponsor. Don't be shy. There's room for everybody. Hold governments to account to implement the calls for justice and the calls to action for the TRC as well. But we need to hold governments to account. We all vote, and we should vote. And we should remind the government that we do vote, and our votes are important for them if they want to return to power. So those are sort of paraphrased about five of about 15 calls for justice. Now, what can you do? I know you have a book club. I know a lot of you are already doing this, but read Indigenous authors. They're wonderful, and there's so many of them. Fiction and nonfiction. If you're not reading Indigenous authors in your book clubs, add them to your book club lists, please. If you're not reading them individually, add them to your lists. We have a little bit more time for reading now in COVID. Follow Indigenous news outlets like APTN and CBC Indigenous, so they are informed about what the ongoing issues are and see a different perspective on issues that are national and regional. There are some online, more local Indigenous news services. Do a little research, Google them, find out what, I don't know if newspaper is the right word to use anymore, but what Indigenous newspapers are being published in your area, and read them and see the Indigenous perspective on current issues. Follow Indigenous organizations and Indigenous leaders on social media. Again, it's a way of educating yourself on the Indigenous perspective on certain issues, and also what issues are for Indigenous people. Then, of course, read the report. There's a 78 or 80 page executive summary that isn't too painful to read. And there's some pretty good pictures in that executive summary as well. Then as an organization, 2 ideas for you. Who's at your decision-making tables, not only in your organization, but also where you work? Are there Indigenous people as equal partners at the decision-making tables, and especially Indigenous women, girls, 2S people, and those with lived experience? Are they at your decision-making tables as equal partners? If not, why not? You could benefit a lot from having people with a different perspective as equal partners. And then I recommend, and I don't know which committee would be the appropriate one to go through the calls for justice and pick out 5, maybe 10, develop a strategy for implementing them, not only in your own organization, but your workplaces, and also decide how you're going to hold governments to account on those calls for justice. So with that, I'm going to close, and I'm very excited to hear the other speakers. And I'm very excited also to get to the Q&A session. So thank you very much for being such an attentive audience.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think you've given us many ideas to take back to our committee, and which we will do. Some of our members know that we have a website, and we have lists of Indigenous authors both for fiction and nonfiction. And we've also been promoting the University of Alberta course on Indigenous Canada. So this is a base which we will certainly expand on. So I'm now going to call on Wynne Blair, another member of the Indigenous Peoples Sub-Committee, to introduce Bev Sellars, who will focus on environmental issues and more specifically, the clash of cultures. Wynne, please.
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Can you? No, we can hear. I can hear you.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. It's my great pleasure to introduce Bev Sellars as a panelist for this webinar. She is the former chief and counselor of the Hatsul with Soda Creek First Nation near Williams Lake, British Columbia. I probably didn't say that nearly as well as you would have, Bev, but I did try to get the air behind my cheeks. She also served as a community advisor for the BC Treaty Commission. Ms. Sellars has spoken out on racism and residential schools and on the environmental and social threats of mineral resource exploitation in her region. Bev Sellars is the author of They Called Me Number One, a memoir published in 2013 of her childhood experience in the Indian residential school system and its effects on 3 generations of women in her family. The book won the 2014 George Riga Prize for Social Awareness, was shortlisted for the 2014 Herbert Evans Nonfiction Prize, and was a finalist for the 2014 Burt Award for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit literature. I read her book, and as a retired primary teacher and a professor at Nipissing Faculty of Education, teaching newbie teachers, I was horrified by all aspects of residential school curriculum, accommodations, discipline, and life. In addressing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Bev quoted from the Historic Trauma and Aboriginal Healing book that says traumatic events need to stop for a period of 40 years before socio-cultural reconstruction and healing begin. Thank goodness Bev's early years and school breaks with her grandmother, her personal fortitude, intelligence, and strength of character overcame her personal trauma and made her the leader she is today. Now I will turn the meeting over to Bev.
Thank you very much. Gee whiz, get me all teary-eyed here. I have a written presentation. When I do presentations, if I don't write it down, it goes all over, and I've got so many things in my mind that I want to say. And because this is a 20-minute presentation, I want it to be focused. So I do have a written one, so bear with me. My daughter and my husband, whenever they go out and speak, they don't need to write it down, and it just kind of flows. And I wish I had that ability, but I don't. So here it is. So my presentation today is a love story. I want to tell you a love story. And it's a love story so deep it has lasted for thousands of years and still exists today. But first, I want to credit my daughter, Nuskamata, also known as Jacinda Mack, for giving me the inspiration for this talk. We are in the process of raising money to film a documentary about Indigenous traditions. And I was feeling a little shaky in the confidence area because this is my first attempt in filming anything. I confided this to my daughter and she responded, "It will be fine. Focus on the love story and how translating place names reveal the active connections. What do they want their lineage to have? How do they pass on knowledge and values and that sacred connection to the land that built them? Just focus on their love stories." Of course, I thought. So let's take a step back just a bit and examine this love story and also the clash of cultures that still exist today. And I just want to say that I've been working with a voice therapist. I have throat problems, and I do hope my voice holds out for this. I did it this morning. Maybe I should have waited until tonight to do the whole thing. But if my voice gets a little shaky, I'm going to carry on, and you'll be able to understand me, I think. So modern ethnology has shown that different cultures have different reasoning systems and different ways of interpreting their experiences. The way we see the world, the way we conceive reality is relative to the culture in which we have been raised. The worldview of most newcomers or settlers, or however you want to define it, to the Americas since 1492 recognized only human beings as persons and the only things deserving of moral and legal consideration. It is easier to explain by saying that a pyramid best describes their view. Humans are at the top of the triangle and everything else exists for the sake of them. Indigenous peoples had their own distinct beliefs that were completely contrary to the new arrivals. Indigenous peoples knew that everything was connected and that everything was alive. The elders say, even the rocks are alive and require the same respect as everything else. A circle describes the Indigenous way of thinking. There is no one place in the circle that is dominant because everything on Mother Earth is equal. Archaeologists and scientists are discovering more and more evidence of what Indigenous peoples have always emphasized through their oral history, that they treated North, Central, and South America as a garden, whether you lived by the oceans or inland. They knew that their survival was dependent on clean water and taking only what you needed. And so with continuous care and the love of Mother Earth and all her gifts, Indigenous people lived by the natural laws of the land and the water. This allowed our societies to thrive. In contrast, before the newcomers arrived in our lands, They were struggling to provide for the growing population of European countries. They had overfished, cut down their trees, and poisoned a lot of their waters. When newcomers first came here, they were amazed at the richness of the lands and the waters. Descriptions such as the land of milk and honey were used, but their love for the land was not the same as the Indigenous peoples. I'm not going to get into this too much, but it really bugs many Indigenous people when our homelands are referred to as the New World. Our homelands are as ancient as any other parts of the world, and by calling it a New World, that dismisses all that Indigenous people have developed, have nurtured, and have shared. I would encourage you to explore some of the Indigenous contributions that people throughout the world use without being aware of their origins. Things such as individual freedom, changes in world cuisine, medicines, sports, transportation, military strategy, government, language, architecture, and so much more. And this is my guarantee to you. The more you research, the more you will realize how much the world has adopted Indigenous cultures. So maybe Indigenous people created a global New World with their many contributions. That, I believe, is more accurate. When you love someone or something, you do everything you can to protect them. You fight for them. You nurture them. You interact with them. Love is a set of emotions and behaviors characterized by intimacy, passion, and commitment. It involves care, closeness, protectiveness, attraction, affection, and trust. All of this the Indigenous people felt for their lands, their waters, and everything in them. Our love was also unquestionable for our children and grandchildren. It is common in many Indigenous communities to think 7 generations ahead to provide and protect the lands and waters for them. In many of the earliest comments by the newcomers, they were amazed at how free and indulged the children were. Indigenous people felt that their most important resource, aside from the lands and waters, were their children. Orphanages, abandoned children, or child labor were unheard of in traditional Indigenous communities. The pure love for this country has, in many cases, become a very abusive relationship. We can see the abusive scars and wounds in the waters and on the lands. This abuse results in many species of animals, birds, and fish, sick or disappearing. When I was getting ready for this presentation, my husband sent me a speech from Chief Dan George, who died in 1981. He was the chief of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, whose territory is in the southwest area of what is now known as the District of North Vancouver in British Columbia. He was also an actor, a musician, a poet, and an author. His quote in one of his speeches goes, "It is hard for me to understand a culture that not only hates and fights his brothers, but even attacks nature and abuses her. I see my white brothers going about blotting out nature from his cities. I see him strip the hills bare, leaving ugly wounds on the face of mountains. I see him tearing things from the bosom of Mother Earth as though she were a monster who refused to share her treasures with him. I see him throw poison in the waters, indifferent to the life he kills there, and he chokes the air with deadly fumes," unquote. Because we are humans, supposedly at the top of the triangle, with our extreme intelligence, we have developed things such as air conditioning or filtered water to hide the damage we are doing. Of course, those communities that are not human do not have access to any of those comforts and have to endure the global warming and pollution that humans create. The continuous fight for our human rights and protection of our territories has never stopped. It had to go underground for a while because our leaders were being put in jail for racist laws under the Indian Act. Since 1951, when the laws changed to give Indigenous people a bit of breathing room, our leaders organized and created enough space and freedom to analyze and integrate concepts of loss and colonialism on our terms. Indigenous people have taken opportunities through the courts, through protests, and through negotiation to carve a new relationship between themselves and the newcomers. We still have a long way to go, but we are making progress. Today, many Indigenous people still honor the cultural responsibility to care for lands and waters in many ways. That includes promoting Indigenous guardian programs and Indigenous protected and conserved areas. We want a valid say in our territories. For too long, we have been silenced or ignored. The clash of cultures regarding lands and waters is still the biggest threat we all have. The love versus the abuse is obvious, and it is going to affect us all. I'll give you an example. On August 4th, 2014, a section of the Mount Poly copper mine tailing pond collapsed, releasing 25 million cubic meters of mine tailings and wastewater into the pristine Quesnel Lake. Parts of the crystal clear lake filled with thick gray mining sludge. For Indigenous people in our communities and downstream who rely on healthy waters for food and cultural practices, the tailings breach was devastating. We held an emergency meeting for our communities the next day. Our elders, one by one, got up to talk about their love of the land, the waters, and all the unique medicines and plants that the area around Quesnel Lake offers. The lake itself provides mitigation, rearing, and spawning habitat for several salmon and non-salmon species. The elders all cried as they talked. To them, a death had happened in the family because they knew it is all connected. The physical plan that a mine sits on does not isolate their footprint. Their footprint stretches throughout the lands and waters. And when you combine that with all the other mines and every other resource extraction company, the abuse guarantees that the future for just 2 or 3 generations ahead is scary. Governments and resource extraction companies don't love this land. They don't love the waters, and they don't love all that it has to offer. They love money, and they will get it regardless of what the real cost is for us and for future generations. Racist laws manage to allow the destructive ways of dealing with the land and waters to become prominent. Indigenous peoples had their traditional teachings interrupted by residential schools that operated for almost 100 years. And some Indigenous peoples have been brainwashed into accepting the monetary way of life over the teachings of their ancestors. The Mount Poly mine did reopen using the same tailings pond that breached. There has been one small find that the mine will fight. No changes, and contrary to the recommendations of the Mount Poly report issued, they are carrying on business as usual. At the end of the day, our grandchildren are left with this mess and contamination. The company will eventually move on. Politicians will comfortably retire. The Indigenous people will remain. There is a saying that only 2 things in life are certain: death and taxes. I say that there are 3 things, and the third is that Indigenous peoples will always be in their territories. We don't have a homeland to go to. This is our homeland, and our holy lands have always been on this continent. We will always be here fighting for our territories and fighting to protect the resources that all our relations, whether they be four-legged, winged, or finned, depend upon. And as we have experienced in my community and seen in many others worldwide, super scale mining and resource extraction is insatiable. There is never enough money made, and projects continue to expand well beyond their original proposals and capacity. These operations consume until they burst at the seams. Then, as we have seen at Mount Poly, they stitch themselves up and continue consuming with the permission of the government. Governments push mining while at the same time they are expected to be the watchdog of mining. Laws are almost meaningless when it comes to real enforcement. Meanwhile, most Indigenous peoples do not have the money to go to court to fight the destruction, and as a last result, use roadblocks. The Indigenous land defenders you see on the news every now and again love their land, love their waters, and love their children and grandchildren, yet they are made out to be criminals. We are not saying that there cannot be resource extraction. We are saying that the man-made laws as they exist are not the solution because they are based only on making money. The natural laws of Mother Earth need to be strengthened for the benefit of the whole human race. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released its final report and published 94 calls to action. For the sake of all our grandchildren, I hope we can make a positive difference. But I would say that the most important call to action needs to be our reconciliation with Mother Earth. We cannot continue to pollute the groundwater, threaten the wildlife, and destroy the habitat of fish, the economy that used to be a guarantee of our survival. Unfortunately, our territories now resemble European countries in 1492 with overharvesting and the poisoning of waters. We need to get out of this abusive relationship, and each one of us has a responsibility to do so. Our waters and lands need a divorce from the abusers. Thankfully, there are a growing number of non-Indigenous who now know the true love of the land and are joining the fight for everyone's survival. We will continue to fight for all of our grandchildren, even the grandchildren of those who are polluting, because even those children, the grandchildren of the polluters, all children, born and unborn, have the right to a healthy environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Bev, for your very thought-provoking presentation. I'm really impressed by the many ideas that you've presented to us. I must say that I really appreciated being able to read your book, They Called Me Number One. And after tonight, I will certainly go and find the others and read those as well. And I'm sure many other people who are on this webinar will do the same.
The second one is, I've only got two.
Well, I'll certainly manage those. I would like to remind everyone to please use the chat to send in your questions. If you want any one particular person presenting to answer, just name her. Otherwise, you can just send it in, and either of the panelists or more than one might want to answer. So I now call on Charlotte Aiken, CFUW's Advocacy Coordinator at our national office in Ottawa, to introduce our next panelist, Lema Ijtemaye. And Lema is going to speak on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, the calls to action, as they relate to the economic well-being and safety of Inuit women, and the work that Poguette has completed to date on this topic. This organization is, I think, located in Ottawa. There will be a direct focus on the resource extraction industry in Canada's north, including the findings of the most recent research report on this industry. Charlotte, please.
I'd like to introduce our final speaker this evening, Lema Ijtemaye. Lema is the Manager of Social and Economic Development Department at Poguette Inuit Women of Canada, the national representative organization for Inuit women in Canada. Founded in 1984, Poguette fosters greater awareness of the needs of Inuit women, advocates for equality and social improvements, and encourages Inuit women's full participation in the community, regional, and national life in Canada. Lema oversees the initiation, development, and completion of projects relating to a broad range of social and economic issues concerning Inuit women, including political equality, women's leadership, climate change, and resource extraction. Lema holds a BA and MA in Honors Political Science from the University of Waterloo, with specializations in state and security, Canadian politics, and international relations. Thank you, Lema, for joining us this evening. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you to CFW for having me here. It's a pleasure to speak on behalf of Poguette, and thank you to Judge Buller and Bev Sellars for your insightful words. It's an honor to speak alongside you two tonight, and thank you to everyone who's joining, and I hope that our work proves to be very interesting. So as mentioned by Charlotte and other folks, I work for Poguette Inuit Women of Canada, which is the national representative organization for Inuit women in the country, representing the interests of Inuit women, not only Inuit Nunangat, the traditional homelands of Inuit in Canada's Arctic regions, but also other regions across the country across Canada where Inuit women and their children and their communities exist. I am situated on the unceded and surrendered Algonquin territory, but originally I am from Afghanistan. I'm a first-generation immigrant from Afghanistan, so I wanted to make that clear before we delve into some of the topics tonight. Looking specifically at the TRC calls to actions, as well as the calls to justice produced by the National Inquiry as they relate to not only economic well-being and safety, but the physical safety and well-being of Inuit women in particular and their children and communities in relation to specifically the activities of the resource extraction industry in Canada's north. A little bit of background on the work and just a general context. The infrastructure reality of Canada's north is very different. Things look very different in Inuit Nunangat in comparison to the rest of the country, particularly in relation to the economic opportunities available to Inuit who live there, which is around, I believe, 65% of the whole Inuit population. So a large chunk of Inuit still living in smaller communities and remote communities. And in terms of infrastructural opportunities, the options available are either one works for the public service, so the federal or territorial government, or one has a private business, which is difficult to launch and sustain, or alternatively, one works in the resource extraction industry because there are so many operations that are currently active on those lands and territories. So as an organization over the years, we've wanted to get a very good understanding of what the impacts of these operations are, not only in terms of the environment, but also the physical well-being of Inuit women and children, as well as their socioeconomic well-being. And recently we've had an opportunity to delve into this further and really look at it holistically across the 4 regions of Inuit and Nunangat, and ourselves get a better understanding as a national organization with regards to how to best advocate with regards to this issue. And we were very critically involved, for example, during the development of the TRC process, and as well as the Inuit submission to the National Inquiry Report, and have taken those calls and the recommendations from both pieces of work and have critically included them in our work as well, and our advocacy work as well. So specifically looking to date, the opportunity we've had so far, and we hope to continue to build on this in the future, but at the moment is to look specifically at the workplace conditions of Inuit women who have either in the past or are currently engaged with the industry, specifically as it relates to sexual violence or instances of sexual violence and harassment encountered by Inuit women who work in that industry. And essentially what we wanted to do is get a good understanding of what the instances are, what are the mechanisms that are available to them, if any, in the workplace to report those instances, and what can the different levels of government, particularly the federal government, do to better monitor the activities of the industry and implement a stronger framework of accountability that can also be taken much more seriously by the industry itself. So in order to do this work, we first conducted a very general literature review that not only looked at the activities of the extraction industry in Canada generally, but more specifically in the North, which really hasn't been or usually isn't delved into as much because of the remoteness geographical remoteness of these lands and territories. And what we found is from the onset, there isn't an inclusion of Inuit women in the processes as a whole. So if there's a general consultation, women aren't included, Inuit women aren't included. If there's a negotiation of impact benefit agreements, Inuit women aren't at the table. It's usually between two parties. And if those impact benefit agreements or IBAs are renegotiated, the case is the same, where the focus is usually on the monetary or revenue generated from the operations, rather than ensuring the socioeconomic as well as physical safety of Inuit workers, in particular Inuit women who work in that industry. We also found that there's a lot of gaps in terms of political agency that the federal government in particular can exercise with regards to making sure that IBAs and other pieces of agreements can be that have been agreed upon are actually being implemented. There's a lack of capacity at a local level to ensure that the industry actors are keeping up to their commitments, and that's where we found in our recommendations, which align with the calls to justice from the National Inquiry Report, is that there's a much bigger role that exists for not only the federal government, but the territorial governments and provincial governments as well across Inuit Nunangat to ensure that the operations are safe, because they are such critical parts of the economic infrastructure. And we want to ensure that Inuit communities and Inuit women in particular have a positive role and can engage in that industry safely. Building on the literature review, we also wanted to do some research work ourselves to get a better understanding of the workplace experiences of Inuit women. So we created a survey, workplace-oriented survey that we delivered to 3 of the 4 regions of Inuit Nunangat before COVID hit. So Northern Quebec, Nunavik, the territory of Nunavut, as well as the Inuvialuit region, which is the northern parts of Northwest Territories. We had a chance to go to, I believe, 5 communities and speak to Inuit women, approximately 30 women that have either previously or are currently working in the industry. And the survey really focused on their workplace experiences around physical safety and sexual harassment and violence, in addition to speaking to them about the services available to them with regards to mechanisms of reporting, if any exist. And if they do exist, how would they essentially rate the efficiency of those services? Are they accessible? Are they available in Inuktitut? Are they clear to understand? What are some of the obstacles for them not using those mechanisms if they are available? And what we found wasn't shocking by any sense of the word. We found that over half the women we spoke to have reported experiencing sexual harassment and violence of some degree at the operations where they are employed, and that oftentimes they are don't make the use of the mechanisms, reporting mechanisms, because either they aren't aware they exist, so that the existence of those mechanisms haven't been communicated properly to them, or they don't believe that reporting would essentially make a difference because of obstacles around racism, sexism, and language barriers. So emerging from this report, on a much more advocacy positive side are recommendations that women made themselves with regards to what they would need to feel safer in the industry. And of course, one of them, the primary one was, for example, to have a more flexible schedule around rotations. Oftentimes women have to leave their communities for 2, sometimes 3 weeks at a time on a rotation and not be available to be around their families and their children in particular, especially young mothers. And these rotations are oftentimes long, they're exhausting. Inuit women who are employed in the industry often do menial labor. They aren't employed in the much more skilled sectors. So for example, housekeeping, much more manual oriented positions, which also inadvertently or advertently directly puts them in positions of much more physical danger oftentimes. So one of the recommendations they had was to have more flexible rotation schedules, in addition to having more Inuit personnel in HR positions, particularly Inuit women in human resources positions that they can feel comfortable speaking to, that there is a shared language affinity, shared cultural affinity, someone that they know will take them seriously and take these very serious incidents into consideration, and they will have the confidence that something will be done with regards to their experiences. In addition to some of the more HR provisions, they also, one of the recommendations was to have on-site childcare availability, which is a huge issue in terms of availability, but also affordability of general childcare in the North. But to have that on-site would be a tremendous asset and a tremendous way that Inuit women can ensure that they can continue to work in the industry when oftentimes they are oftentimes the primary supporters of their families or one of the central economic supporters of their families. So what we hope to do, even though this is concentrated specifically on workplace situations and workplace violence and addressing workplace sexual harassment and violence, as that we hope that this work will serve as some foundation for more political advocacy with regards to including Inuit women from the very onset when operations are being discussed. So whether that be at the local community level or a regional level or at the land claims level, to include Inuit women from the onset with regards to any kind of environmental feasibility studies, any gender community consultations should be ideally gendered. These aspects are currently not mandated any type of negotiated impact benefit agreement or even land claims agreement, which are very much focused on the revenue that's generated instead of ensuring these other very critical aspects are included. We hope that this work will serve as a foundation for the recommendations will be taken seriously, not only by the industry actors, but also by the provincial and territorial actors and the federal government with regards to what they can do, what their roles should be with regards to monitoring and keeping the industry accountable and making sure that there's political agency, fundamentally that's what we're talking about, political agency for Inuit women to exercise their right to engage in the local and regional labor market and economy, and to be able to do that safely and without fear of losing their jobs or being targets of violence. So we hope that this work will serve as a foundational piece moving forward, and that we will be able to continue to advocate on behalf of Inuit women at the local, regional, and national levels. And I'm happy to share the results in more detail if anyone has any questions around literature review or the survey report or what we do as an organization. And I'm happy to field any questions from folks who are here tonight as well. Thank you very much, Pandemic.
Thank you very much, Lema, and I'm sure there will be questions. The first thing I want to say, though, is Sharon is about to talk to you about questions on chat, but we've been alerted that for some people, the chat function has been disabled. So in that case, what you can do is go to the bottom of your screen and you see reactions. If you open that, you'll have an option to raise your hand. So if you do that, then Charlotte will set up a speakers list. If that doesn't work for you, just raise your hand and Charlotte will see you and add you to the list. In the meantime, for those for whom the chat function is working, I'm going to ask Sharon if she would now come on and please speak to that. Sharon?
Thank you, Grace. We've listened to three absolutely outstanding speakers who have raised a lot of points, a lot of information, and a lot of perhaps questions. And this is a great time for you to get an answer from the experts. So I know that there've been a couple of notices as you've gone through about putting your questions in the chat, but I will remind you again that if you have a question you have not put in the chat, please do so. Or as Grace mentioned, raise your hand and we'll make sure that you're on the list. Charlotte will be receiving these and she'll handle those. And if you have a particular question to a particular speaker, please mention that. If not, we'll open to the floor and all three speakers may wish to respond. So Charlotte, I'll turn everything over to you.
Perfect. So thank you so much, everyone, for your thoughtful presentations. We got a few questions in the chat, and I want to address maybe two put together for Judge Buller specifically. There's one question: is there any update on the status of a national action plan in response to the national inquiry? And I saw your eyebrow raise, and then. And are you able to speak to the calls for justice that have been achieved? So some enlightening or happy news on that
front. Thank you. Good questions. An update on the National Action Plan. The short answer is I don't know. I'm not involved in the National Action Plan at all. I only know what I read in the media. When we finished on June 30th, 2019, that was the end of my involvement. So the short answer, don't know. What I can tell you though, is that Yukon Territory has done an outstanding job of developing their strategy for implementing the calls for justice. And without going into a lot of detail about it, if I don't have the website handy, but if you Google Yukon and MMIWG, you'll be able to link into their report and their strategy that they're actually working on. So in Yukon, they've actually started working on some of the calls for justice directly. But I really don't know about the National Action Plan. The calls for justice that have been achieved, not squarely. The government has allocated more funding for transition houses and safe houses in the north, but there hasn't been, but that's over a 5-year period. And really when it's time to see, you know, how many front doors can you open? It's really not a lot. And Lima can probably speak to that better than I can in terms of details. The federal government did pass legislation regarding child welfare on reserves so that First Nations can take over or retake their jurisdiction over child welfare for kids on reserve land. But in terms of the rest of the calls for justice, that's really all I'm aware of. The difficulty is there's no one place to go on the internet to find out who's doing what. And hopefully the National Action Plan will address that. Thank you.
All right, did any of the other speakers want to address that, or shall I move on? Okay, so I have another question. This could be answered by all the panelists. And do you have any comments on the impact of hydro development? And this person references, for example, in Manitoba, hydro has completely altered the landscape with flooding impacting fishing, communities and sacred sites. And the camps of the hydropower are a source of violence against Indigenous women. So I'm wondering if any panelists would like to comment on that. Yeah, go ahead, Bev.
I can comment a little bit on Site C in BC. I'm not involved in it, but I do know that, they're trying to push it ahead, even though it's going to cost billions of dollars. It's ridiculous. And there are so many problems with it. And that just, that just shows how they operate, without thinking of the communities. There's a lot of the Indigenous people that below Site C, they're going to lose their lands, they're going to lose their hunting areas. And I can't speak to Manitoba, but I would imagine it would be something similar over there. And it's just, it's full speed ahead without thinking of everything, and the hunting grounds and the animals and everything else that relies on it. There's no consideration for that. So yeah, that's all I can say.
Lima, would you like to speak on this as well?
Sure. Yeah. With regards to hydro specifically, I know of the Muskrat Falls situation in the Nunatsiavut region. That's been a point of concern for Inuit in the Nunatsiavut region and Labrador specifically, and the concerns of the contamination of the Churchill River and the ongoing criminalization of Nunatsiavut land defenders with regards to that. And the concerns are very much around contamination of water, which not only affects sources of water, but in turn will affect the wildlife and animals that are used as sources of food directly by communities, which already face such critical degrees of food insecurity that aren't being addressed by the federal government or Indigenous Services Canada. And to then also impose operations that haven't necessarily gone through the proper channels of free, prior, and informed consent only adds to the issue. With regards to hydro, that's that, but the case is the same around all sort of extraction projects that are situated in Inuit Nunavut. Most recently, it's been around Baffinland and the expansion of the Baffinland operation located in the Baffin region, closer to Iqaluit and other 5 communities in Inuit Nunavut, and the concerns brought forward not only by hunters, but also community members with regards to the impact not only on the land, but the migration patterns of animals, which will make it that much harder for communities who sometimes solely only depend on hunters for sources of food when prices of food are astronomical at northern and local grocery stores. The same things have been heard around the Quebec region of Nunavut, where the operation there, the gold operation there, and Agnico operations have also, community members have said, affected the migration patterns of caribou, which can be very significant when hunters have to go out to different places during winter in particular, and sometimes be gone weeks at a time, putting them in direct danger. So whether it be hydro or gold or iron ore, the impacts of sort of the parallels are very much similar, and exacerbation of only contamination of wildlife and sacred territory, but also exacerbating situations of food insecurity, which is astronomical and one of the worst in any sort of OECD state in the world, which is an incredible, shameful thing.
I'd just like to add about the issue of man camps. We found in the work that we did at the National Inquiry that man camps certainly create a lack of safety and security for the women who work in the camps, but also for women who live in nearby communities, because of course people working at these man camps earn a lot of money. They force the cost of living in surrounding communities to rise, and Indigenous women anyway, are forced even more into the margins economically and are unsafe as a result of that. Also, what we found in the work that we did do, and we just really started work on man camps, we didn't get as much done as I'd hoped we would, that not only do they creates a lack of safety at the man camps and in neighboring communities, but within families, because of the, maybe 2 weeks in, 2 weeks out arrangement. And it just is a breeding ground for violence, intimate partner violence. So a real problem. And we made calls for justice, hopefully, to address all aspects of violence against Indigenous women that are created by these man camps. So great question, thanks.
Thank you so much for your responses. Carol Scott, I see your hand raised. If you'd just like to unmute and ask the panelists your question, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm speaking to you from the unceded Mi'kmaq territory in Moncton, New Brunswick. And I just want to say what an amazing, amazing evening. I was just on another Zoom and I thought, oh, I'm too tired. And I thought, no, I've got to go. I am so grateful that I've come. I would like to ask a little bit about the May 5th, the Red Dress Day. We are planning our church in, I'm partly in a community in Ottawa as well as in Moncton, New Brunswick. And we are planning our red dress installation and having an Anishinaabe elder to bless the dresses before there will be interpretive text along with it, but we want it to be considered serious and that this is a memorial as well as support for the families and those who are still missing and those who are feeling insecure. Our question is, because we're in a pandemic situation, what is your perspective in terms of putting up displays, having elders involved with doing a blessing ceremony at this time? Is, May 5th, can we defer this a few weeks or a couple months and still have the impact? Thank you.
I'll take a shot at that. I mean, it's going to be outside, and I think if you're far enough away that an elder can give a blessing. And I'm not sure if you're in the city, but where I am, the dresses are hung on the highway in the bush, so it's easy to have that kind of ceremony. So I guess it would take a little more thought if you were in the city, and with especially in BC anyway. People aren't supposed to be going inside a church or inside restaurants and stuff like that. So I guess it would depend on the situation, but having the elders bless the dresses, I think could easily be done for COVID. As to moving the ceremony, I mean, I think that would be fine as well. I mean, you have to be safe. And I'm just, I had to cancel filming at the end of April because I'm dealing with Indigenous elders. And the last thing that I want to do is to put them in danger in any way. They've all had their first COVID shot, but, they feel uncomfortable because they haven't had the second one. So I think, just kind of sum up the circumstances. And if you have to move it, move it. I mean, the dresses will be out there, they're hanging around and hanging in wherever you decide to put them, and whether it's on May 5th or somewhere else. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that will be online as well, so you could do that as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going through the screen, so if you do have a question, please raise your hand either on the Zoom function or on your camera. But I have another question. This is for all the panelists. I'm wondering how maybe in mainstream Canadian politics, indigeneity is often divorced from issues of gender and feminism. So I'm wondering how we can understand Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination as integrally women's issues. So, you know, it not divorcing gender from indigeneity and seeing maybe how we can bridge that intersection.
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Sure. So
Maybe.
how possibly how can we integrate, you know, an Indigenous perspective to mainstream women's issues? I guess is what I'm trying to say. So.
Oh, this should have happened when everybody first came here, because Indigenous women in our societies were at least equal to, and in many of the matrilineal cultures were above the men. You know, my husband is, he's Liquithta from Vancouver Island, and his mom was a matriarch there, a matrilineal society. And there was this bill that was passed before Indigenous women under the Indian Act. When you got married, you went under the man's name if he and the community if he was status Indian, but if you married a non-status person, they lost their status. Anyway, that's my husband's mom did. Her second husband was non-Indigenous, and so she lost her status. And along came Bill C-31, where, you know, Indigenous women like that had fought. They went to the international court to try to get that back. And so when a CBC reporter asked my husband's mom, how do you feel? You're finally going to be equal. How does that feel to you? And she said, I've never been equal in my life, and I'm not going to take a step down now, she says, you know. So this whole thing, I know when women's rights and everything came, it in the Indigenous community, traditionally, it wasn't like that. We weren't subservient to men. And, you know, in our community, even though we have an elected system, most of our women since 1951 have been, or most of our chiefs have been women chiefs. And we were talking about it, and we were saying, yeah, it would be something if no women ran for council, because in our community, women are the backbone and women are the decision makers. So this should have happened. We should have made it happen right from the start.
But, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I really can't add anything to what Bev said. She said it perfectly.
Barbara, I see you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Charlotte. And all three of the speakers could maybe answer this. CFUW is, among other things, an advocacy organization, and we advocate for various issues of concern to our members. And generally, those are women's issues, but not always just entirely women's issues. And if you were to choose something that you would suggest we could advocate on at either the national or provincial level, because we do both, what would that be? Ooh.
I think if I'm just going to pick one thing, Barbara, it would be to press the federal government to get busy on that national action plan and release it, and to report annually. I honestly don't know what the problem is. They promised the National Action Plan about a year ago, coming up to 2 years now, and nothing's happened. And they've been blaming COVID. There've been a variety of excuses, but I'm not seeing anything. And the work is done. All they have to do is develop a plan or a strategy for implementation for the calls for justice. They don't have to go back and reinvent the wheel. The calls are all right there. I think that's the most, from my perspective at this point anyway, perhaps the most urgent.
I think for me, I would learn, am I still on? Did I?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. I advocate for everybody learning Canada's history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, you know, because there's a lot of ignorance out there, and a lot of people are always, you know, like people say, oh, Native people get everything for free. They get a free house, they get a free truck, they get free education, they get all of this. And I keep telling people, I'm going to go looking for that place, and I'm going to transfer there when I find that place. And, you know, but a lot of it, you know, ignorance, a lot of times you don't have the information, then it turns into racism. So for me, in order for everybody to understand the history of Canada, it has to be taught right from the beginning. And the contributions by Indigenous people are just amazing. And, you know, like when I think of how we changed the world with all that we had to offer in North, Central, and South America, you know, like that needs to become common knowledge for everyone.
For myself, that's a difficult question, and I'll come from a socioeconomic perspective because that's the portfolios I work on. But it's to really, in practice, let Inuit fundamentally govern themselves. So even though there are land claims agreements in place, the political agency of Inuit oftentimes is still curtailed, but mostly by the federal government. Because of the ongoing impacts of colonial history, not only history, but ongoing colonial policies, whether it's the forced settlements into remote communities, which has led to the lack of critical shortage of housing, and not stepping up and taking responsibility for the shortage of housing, and also making traditional hunting very inaccessible. So they're not only siloed issues, it all sort of builds up into this curtailing of political agency, of self-governance, even though that's what the current government puts an emphasis on, or likes to put an emphasis on, is sort of equal partnership and letting Indigenous folks lead. That's very much not the case. So it's moving out of the way when necessary for Inuit to govern themselves, but also taking responsibility in areas where they have made a commitment to take responsibility, but often they don't measure up. So that would be my perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Marilyn, please go ahead. Oh, you're muted, Marilyn.
There. I'll return to the mention of Indigenous Canada as a course that you can take. It's the University of Alberta, but the online platform is called Coursera, COURSERA, and you can take it for free if you don't want a certificate for your resume or whatever. And the second course is that I found was really good is University of Toronto, Indigenous Worldview and Education. And I think it's been being given for about 8 years. And so it took me a long time to find those. They're both for free on Coursera, if that's how you want. And they're, maybe 10 hours a week.
Are they taught by Indigenous people?
Yes, not completely, but they have them in Indigenous people in the Calgary or the University of Alberta one, certainly. And it's a few years since I took it. I can't remember who lectures in the other one, but it was just like eye openers. And the Toronto one is as I recall, it's given for teacher training, so it's fairly up to date on things too, compared to what I used to know. My Canadian history.
There's another question. This comes from Grace as well, and for any of the panelists, are there any recommendations, or do you know of any successful cases in the past of integrating Indigenous curriculum into school boards curriculum? So any thoughts on that, or any successful cases? or advice to school boards in order to integrate Indigenous curriculum into the mainstream curriculum?
Yeah, in my area, the Seguapan, the Northern Seguapan, we have an elders group that that is developing curriculum, and they have all been teaching in the schools. And they started that because before in BC, they taught the Haida culture, which, I mean, I love the Haida. They're a great tribe and they have so much to offer and everything, but they were teaching this to our Seguapan children, and we're like 300 miles inland from any ocean, so it didn't work. So you know, just our area, and then we have the First Nations Education Steering Committee. I think it's a province-wide organization, and I think they try to get, I don't think they've been as successful as they had hoped, but there's a little bit in there now. So, but I think the universities are the ones that have taken it upon themselves to teach Indigenous education or Indigenous issues and whatever. So more than the high schools and the elementary schools.
I'm sorry, I don't remember the names of the schools, but I know in central Saskatoon, and maybe some of the may know already, I think it's it used to be Bedford Road Collegiate, but I could be wrong. It's now an inner city school, and mostly Indigenous kids with an Indigenous curriculum. And then in Thunder Bay, the school where kids fly from remote communities to attend school. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of that. They have an Indigenous curriculum as well, because it's basically all Indigenous kids. Those are two that come to mind. Where I live, the school board has an Indigenous curriculum advisory group, and they're looking at the end goal of indigenizing curricula in all subjects. It's going to take a while, but at least they've started.
Yeah, and we asked that because a lot of CFUW members were teachers at one time or are still currently teaching, and you know, there's always a discussion of how to integrate more of these perspectives into teaching. And also there's the education guide that we produced called Their Voices Will Guide Us, and that's still on the website. Wonderful. Marilyn, I see your hand is raised, but was this a mistake or? Do you have another question? Just trying to unmute. Well, in the meantime,
I just came across a student, a master's student at the University of Saskatchewan has developed a teaching aid, and basically the students, you know, for elementary school, identify the original Indigenous clans that are where they live, and then they do research into what those people, you know, in the prairies, it was different hunting than that would happen in Ontario, and so it lets them research exactly what children their age would have been doing, and apparently it's there's a lot of resources available there for that. So this is fairly new.
Thanks so much for that suggestion. Audrey, do you have a question?
I just want to jump in. BC, because I work for the government, or it did, has Indigenous ways of knowing in our new curriculum, and it's BC wide. And the person that would be good for the committee to talk to is a brilliant young Aboriginal woman, Denise Augustine, who is now at the Ministry of Education, and I'll send you her how to get in touch with her. She would be really useful for the committee.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Perfect. I'm scrolling through. There's a lot of pages still, but I know that there's a specific question to Bev, and we're asking if you could elaborate a bit on the Indigenous Guardian program that you mentioned.
Oh, definitely. I'm with the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, and you can go to their website. It's www.ilinationhood.ca, and you can find out about Indigenous Guardians there. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to connect the youth with the elders, you know, and put the youth out on the land, and they learn from the elders in their specific area, and they act as guardians. They go out and see, you know, like if there's, I don't know, if people are using skidoos in a moose calving area or something, you know, they're aware of that, and it's the work that they do is amazing. They go out and they document everything, and the Indigenous Guardians in BC have along the coastal area have more information because they've got that Indigenous knowledge, that intimate knowledge that the Indigenous elders have. They're able to collect that. And the Department of Fisheries and Oceans does not have that kind of information. So they go to the Indigenous Guardians to get information from them. And they're, you know, like I've heard it said, I don't know how many times, that science is finally catching up to Indigenous knowledge. And it's no surprise that the Indigenous people have so much knowledge about an area, you know, because we've lived here for thousands of years, you know, and that information has been passed down. And just like out at Quesnel Lake when Mount Polly happened, and they were wondering what kind of fish was out there. And our Indigenous elders said that there was, oh geez, what was the name of that fish? Freshwater flounder, I think they called it. And the scientists were saying, no, there's no such thing in there. And they, after they did a survey of everything, and they found that fish, but our Indigenous elders knew that. So that's what, and so that knowledge is being passed down to Indigenous Guardians, and it's to help, you know, and the Indigenous Guardians are so proud of the work they've done. And one little boy, they were talking, you know, at one of the conferences, and somebody said, what are you going to do when you grow up? And he says, I'm going to be a guardian like my dad, you know, so that's what it is. But go to ilinationhood.ca and you'll find out all about it.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to scroll through to see if we have any final questions. But if not, I'd like to pass it over to Sharon Crabb to share her final remarks with us. And just again, thank you everyone for coming and sending in your questions and participating.
Thank you, Charlotte. It's been an absolutely wonderful night. And, you know, you think we know lots of things, but then we listen to speakers like we've had tonight and we learn how little we know and how much we need to know. And all we wanted to do now is decide what action we can take. So as mentioned was in the beginning, the theme of this year's Indigenous Peoples Committee was to educate ourselves and others. Thus, our focus over the last few months has been how we might best provide support or resources for our CFUW members in their clubs across Canada. One major undertaking was to update and reorganize our Indigenous Peoples information, which is on the CFUW members website. And that includes a list of speakers, films, books, and other relevant materials. I think the book list now is well over 100 books. So I was glad to hear the speakers talk about adding a book by an Indigenous author to your book clubs, because that's something that we would like to promote with all clubs. Another major undertaking was to organize a webinar with Indigenous speakers who could share their expertise with us and identify ways in which we might learn more about the issues of importance to Indigenous people, which also should be issues of importance to us, and how we might best assist and or support those issues. And panelists have given us a lot of ideas and calls for action that we might be able to take. Today's panelists have provided a rich learning environment. They've shared their expertise. They've helped us to better understand some of what's most important to Indigenous people. Things like healthcare, housing, water, land, social justice, missing and murdered women and girls, education, the economy. And that's just to mention a few things. Thank you to, I'd like to express my thank you to Judge Marion Buller, Bev Sellars, and Lema Ijtemaye for providing an environment today when we could listen and learn, identify actions and that we might take to support Indigenous people and our communities. Thank you to the CFUW Indigenous Peoples Committee. They've worked really, they're a great bunch. They have unlimited energy and enthusiasm, and that's why we've resulted in this fabulous webinar tonight. So I thank all of them for all the work they have done, and for Grace Hollett, who co-chairs with me. She does all the work and I just do some writing, so that's easy. A special thanks to Charlotte, CFUW Advocacy Coordinator, for all your work in organizing this webinar. I'm sure you'll be glad to get rid of some of all these emails that come back your way throughout the days and the weeks before this webinar, and for your Zoom housekeeping details, and for the outstanding question and answer segment that you provided. And I want to thank all of the people in attendance for the questions. And I'm sure that you may have other questions. So if you think of something, I'm sure if you email it to Charlotte, she'll make her way to the committee, because Charlotte serves on our committee as well. Thank you to all who have donated to the CFUW Charitable Trust Fellowships and the Awards Program, and to those of you who may consider donating in the days ahead. And to each of you, I'm just amazed by the number. I started out thinking, you know, maybe we'll get 40 or 50 people. And then Charlotte says we've got 160. And then tonight, 190 some. It just shows the interest that's out there and the desire that, that women generally want to be able to step up and help other women in the best way that we can. And our speakers tonight have given us lots of opportunities and thoughts for that. So to each of you, thank you so much for coming to this Indigenous Issues Calls for Action webinar. And we look forward to hearing about your calls to action initiatives. So once you make that, which one are you going to choose, please let us know. So thanks very much for everybody. I don't know if others have last minute comments or not. If not, we say good night.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Right.
Reg, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot for inviting us.
Thank you, speaker.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.